ultimately goes over to Egypt and then comes back up out of Egypt and ends up back here in this area around Hebron, right in that area right there, which I'm not drawing very well because it's right about there. He's right around Hebron at this point. And Lot, of course, is separated. Lot is now living over in Sodom, which would have been over about roughly here. And so they're from one another. But now we have a series of events that's going to dramatically affect both of them. We start off in chapter 14 and we find this political situation developing. I'll call it political. It is a conflict that is going on, and Abram and Lot find themselves caught up in it rather against their will. Reading in verse chapter 14, it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Sinab, king of Adam, Shimber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All of these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. These fellows come down out of the north. We go back to our map. We were to go back to our map, we would find that all of these kings are coming out of this northern area up here, and they are coming down and making raids into this more southern region. Says verse 4, 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtoreth Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Imim in Shavath Kiratham, and the Horathites in their Mount Seir, as far as El-Paran, which is by the wilderness. They come down and they begin immediately to knock off what I guess we would call as tribal groups. And so here's these raiders coming down, and they're going to be sweeping through this area, and they're first attacking these smaller, I guess I would call them tribal units, and some of the fighters there. So verse 7, then they turned back and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they were battle against them in the valley of Siddim. And so here, this force now coming out of the south, this group of kings, and they array in battle against these raiders from the north. Probably what was happening, some of the commentators suggest what was happening. There is a fairly lucrative trade route that's going through this area because there is trade between Mesopotamia and between Egypt. And so these two regions have got goods. This is becoming a trade route and been under the control of this King Chedorlaomer for some 12 years. He's basically had them, and so these other kings, they decide they're not going to do them. We're going to pay him tribute to allow these goods to go flowing through their area, and so they rebel. As you know, well, Chedorlaomer doesn't want to see his, and so he immediately raises this army to come in and come down after these rebels, as he would see them, and so he's going to come down and as we see here, he first attacks these kind of smaller tribes and gaining some confidence and gaining some ground. Now he comes after the bigger cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. We see that here and they come against them in the valley of Siddim, and against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, and Eraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Eleazar, 4 kings against 5, says Moses here as he writes this, and noting the scope of this battle. This would have been a significant historical event for these folks. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. This valley of Siddim is probably just north of the Dead Sea area. It's probably just north of the city. So these kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are coming out of their cities, and they're just going to this valley that's immediately to the north of them to meet these raiders from the north. Now the king of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them, but those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. And so they also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. Here we should understand, first of all, from verse 10, when it says the kings of Sodom and the kings of Gomorrah fell, when it says that they fell, this was not the kings themselves. The king of Sodom and king of Gomorrah did not themselves perish in these tar pits. Their men fell into it. And what happened here, according to, again, what the commentators will tell us or suggest to us, is this was a rout. This would have been a complete defeat of the forces of Sodom and Gomorrah. They are just completely driven from the battlefield. They are so driven away from the battlefield that they have to flee back through these tar pit areas, and their army is essentially destroyed. They take all their goods. We saw here in verse 11, they took all their goods, all their food supplies, and they leave. Notice that they take all their food supplies. This was a means of coercion. It's telling these southern cities, well, you'll either play ball with us or you'll starve, because there's apparently limited food available, and if you don't do what we say, we'll just starve you out of here. We see also that Lot is taken captive. Don't know why they picked Lot. There is some speculation he might have been a hostage. They may have taken several folks out of the city of Sodom as hostages. Might have even taken him as a slave, but we don't know. We don't know exactly why he might have been, if he was singled out or if he was just scooped up with a bunch of other hostages and taken along. But this does set the stage for the rest of the events. This battle does set the stage, because what we see next is here's Abram now, who's drawn into this. We see that he still has this deep affection for his nephew, and he's determined to help out. And so in verse 13, it says, then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. So here we find him over by these oaks of Mamre, over on the west bank of the Jordan River. And when Abram had heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods and he also brought back his relative Lot and all his possessions, and also the women and the people. So apparently we understand from this that a number of captives had been taken by this raiding party, perhaps as hostages, perhaps as slaves. Another thing, several things we can note about this section. here's Abram. He's first called the Hebrew. We see that in verse 13. Abram is first called the Hebrew here as a designation of him being different from the other tribes and people that were living in this area. It is an acknowledgement of his nomadic existence, that he would be moving around from place to place in this area, and was not really a part of the community in that sense. He was not really one of the normal residents. He would have been like a resident alien or something like that in this area. He takes off and leads this force. He has the men, his retainers, basically his retinue of servants that come with him. About over 300 men, 318 says the text. Here's these men that are all going out, but they were certainly going against a force that would have been far larger than 318. And so we see a little bit of the faith of Abraham in that he's going to go after this much larger, we can presume, much larger force with a relatively small force of 300. He pursues them into northern Canaan, even up as far as Damascus, it says, and he wins their decisive battle. Well, why does he win? Well, he wins because, first of all, he's aided. He's got three allies. He's got Mamre, he's got Eshcol, and he's got Aner with him. These three allies with him to help fight. He attacks at night. Now, we have to understand how unusual this was. We talked about this to some degree, I think, when we, back years ago when we studied the book of Judges together. And if you remember Gideon, how Gideon attacked at night, and he used the torches. And he used the torches to confuse the enemy and confuse their numbers. Most of the time when this fighting was going on, nobody attacked at night. It was too easy to get confused by who was on whose side. It was too easy to get lost in the dark. And so armies just didn't attack at night. And so by Abram pulling off this raid on the enemy camp at night, it turns out to be very successful. He has the surprise. These fellows have come back from this successful raid. They've scattered the armies of Sodom and Gomorrah and are undoubtedly assuming that there's nobody left to come after them. And so here comes Abram and his three allies with their forces coming in to raid on their camp, and they're simply not expecting it. He does something that, again, is extremely dangerous. According to the military strategy, he splits his forces. You don't typically split your forces when you have the lower numbers in the face of an enemy. That's usually a recipe for suicide. But no, Abram divides his forces so he can attack from multiple points, and that adds to the confusion in the enemy camp. And so he is able to successfully overcome them. Plus, again, they're weary from this this campaign that they've done, where they've come down out of the north, been doing this raiding, been doing this fighting, and now have gone back to the north. And so they're undoubtedly weary from that. And so Abram takes advantage of all these opportunities that he has, all of these circumstances that favor him, and he successfully raids in. It says again, he is able to rescue Lot. He's able to rescue women and other people that had been taken captive, and begins to take them back to the south. Chapter 17. Now, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he gave him a tenth of all. Now, this is a fairly small passage, but this is a very small passage with a lot of impact, as we're going to see. This is a simple couple of sentences here about Abram meeting up with Melchizedek, but what we're going to ultimately see is what a tremendous part of God's plan, a part of God's strategy this is in bringing in the Messiah. Like I said, it seems to be a very obscure, not necessarily obscure, but a very a sort of minor part of this story. And yet we're going to see that this little episode has major implications. He goes on to say, the king of Sodom said to Abram, give the people, let me start again. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, give the people to me and take the goods for yourself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men of Eden and the share of the men who went with me, Emer, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their share. And so here is Abram making it clear that he is not going to be enriched. If he's going to be enriched by anyone, he'll be enriched by God, but he's not going to let the king of Sodom have a claim to helping Abram become a wealthy man. Couple of things, though, I want to back up. I want to focus on this episode between Abram and Melchizedek, because this really is, we don't necessarily see it here, but this really is a crucial turning point, a crucial event in God setting up the Messiah. Melchizedek brings out bread and wine. Why bread and wine? Here are these folks that have just captured all the food stores that had been stolen from them by these northern raiders. They got their food back. They've already eaten, according to what Abram tells us that they've already eaten. Yet here comes Melchizedek presenting Abram with bread and wine. This bread and wine, this was typically the food of royalty. You would serve the king or other royal members fine bread and wine. And so it was an honor. It was meant to honor Abram from Melchizedek. It was meant to be an honor to him. It was also used to symbolically seal a covenant in this day. And so by this, we might understand that Melchizedek is seeking some kind of a covenant relationship with Abram. We notice here that Melchizedek is described as priest of God Most High. Some Bible critics and Bible skeptics have tried to accuse Abram of inventing this whole religion, inventing this whole idea of an almighty God. No, here that's not the case, because here we find a man who is meeting Abram apparently for the first time, and yet he's already described as a priest of God Most High. And so therefore, to suggest that Abram invented this religion and came up with it on his own is ridiculous. It simply does not fit what we know. They both acknowledge this name. They use this name El Elyon, which is the God Most High, or Almighty God in some translations, as the source of the victory. We notice that Abram, it says, won't take any of the spoil. Instead, in verse 20, he says, and he gave him a tenth of all. That he is referencing to Abram, because he's the immediate precedent. Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all. And of course, we see that acknowledged in the writings of Paul. Here's just to show you, though, how this comes about and what this really means, and especially the impact, the import for us as Christians today. Here is a kind of a timeline. You can see this. Here is Abram. He meets Melchizedek. This event is taking place roughly, between 1900 and 2,000 years before Jesus, before Christ. And so the event takes place. Moses now is recording it in the book of Genesis, as he writes the book in the book of Genesis, and he records it about 1500. We find, though, that this event now is going to get mentioned again. If you flip over with me to the book of Psalms, if you read there in Psalms 110, this is a Psalm of David. And he says there in Psalm 110, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet. The Lord will stretch forth his strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of thine enemies. Thy people will volunteer freely in the day of thy power. In holy array from the womb of the dawn, thy youth are to thee as the dew. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. Thou art a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at thy right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge among the nations. He will fill them with corpses. He will shatter the chief men over the broad country. He will drink from the brook of the wayside. Therefore, he will lift up his head. Here we see this passage here, this psalm written by David, now some 500 years after it's been recorded by Moses, about 1000 BC. And what does David say? Well, David makes reference, and we see here in verse 4, thou art a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And I can tell you from a little bit of research I've done, the Jews were puzzling over this passage and have been puzzling over it for quite some time, trying to figure out what did David mean when he wrote this. Well, I believe, though, that Paul explains it. He explains the significance now some 1,000 years, actually more than 1,000 years after the time of David. Now here comes Paul with an explanation. We see here and this is the point here that I want to make from Ephesians. Paul writes there and says, for this cause I, Paul, am the prisoner of Jesus Christ for you nations. If you have heard of the dispensation of the grace of God, which is given me toward you, that by revelation he has made known to me the mystery, as I wrote before in few words, of which when you read, you may understand my knowledge in the mystery of Christ. Well, this is one facet of the mystery of Christ, is that, we have this episode of Abram with Melchizedek. Here we have this mention of Melchizedek by David. What does it all mean? How does this come together in the Messiah? If we look, we'll find again, here is that record of the events that are taking place here in Genesis 14. Moses records it almost, I say it as an afterthought. It's given very minor treatment in the book of Genesis. But we then find David mentioning it in Psalms 110, where we just read, and he says, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And again, the Jews were kind of curious and baffled by this. What did this statement mean? And Paul uses this now and explains it over in Hebrews. If we look in the book of Hebrews, and this ought to be familiar to most of us. But when we look here in Hebrews, for example, we start here in the 5th chapter. And he says, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself is beset with weaknesses. And because of it, is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, and also for himself. And no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. Just as he also says also in another passage, thou art a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Here is Paul. We see him here quoting from this passage here in Genesis, from Psalms. We see him quoting the passage from Psalms. And he goes on, in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save from death. And he was heard because of his piety. Though he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. He goes on there from there. Paul goes on from there to explain Jesus, of course, is a better high priest. and has been, at verse 10, as it says in verse 10, being designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, who made Jesus a high priest? Well, the answer is God. God made Jesus the high priest. God declared he was going to be high priest, and God proclaimed him to be high priest, according to Paul. He goes on from there. He goes on from there in verse, starting in verse 19 of chapter 6, and says, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters through within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And he hits that point again. We see him hit at that point again, and now he explains it in chapter 7. This whole chapter 7 is an explanation of how that can be. Now remember that Hebrews here is being written. Most of the scholars who study this agree would have been written probably either just before the destruction of Jerusalem. And so here we have these Jewish Christians, perhaps, who have had some reliance on the Old Testament law, and they've even tried to incorporate the Old Testament law. We've been studying that on Wednesday night, where they were trying to incorporate elements of the Old Testament law on Christians. There in Acts 15, we find this. And here is Paul explaining why that's no longer valid. I wondered as I began to read this, if perhaps some of the same arguments that Paul makes here in Hebrews, if he didn't make these same arguments when he was disputing with the false teachers there in Acts 15, making the same points, because this is a powerful argument showing that the old law is now done away, because here is Jesus Christ. He is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, and that of necessity means the supersede, that the law of Moses has been superseded. Yeah. Yeah. I was looking for that passage and I couldn't find it. Where you said it's in Zechariah? Yes. 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 I was looking for that passage and I couldn't find it. I couldn't even find enough of it to track it down. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, both roles in one person. Yes. And that's the interesting part out of the Old Testament, is that God deliberately separated the political authority, the king, from the religious authority. You know, there was never a king out of the tribe of Levi. We had a king out of the tribe of Benjamin, you know, in Saul, for example, and then it switched over to the tribe of Judah through David, and then descended through David. So those two tribes provided the kings. But before that, you know, you never see anyone from the tribe of Levi being a king, and yet that's where the priest came through. And so in order to put all of that authority in one person, as we understand Jesus saying there at the end of Matthew, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. All authority. He has both the religious authority and that political authority, or that governing authority. And how does he have that? Because he is now both priest and king, as you point out. Yeah, I was looking at it. Thank you, Rita, because I had been looking for that passage and could not remember where it was. Could not track it down. As we go in, though, as we continue on in chapter 7, we see how Paul is using this example to make this explanation. He says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham when he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham appointed a 10th part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and also King of Salem, which is King of Peace." That's what Salem literally means, is peace. And so if he's King of Salem, he is the King of Peace. And so here is, I think, Paul making the idea that here is Melchizedek sort of being the type for Jesus, who becomes the antitype, which Paul uses that kind of type and antitype presentation throughout this book of Hebrews. He says, "Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he abides a priest perpetually. Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a 10th of his choicest spoils. And those indeed, the sons of Levi who received the priest's office, have commandment in the law to collect a 10th from the people, that is, from their brethren, though they are all descended from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected a 10th from Abraham, and blessed the one who had the promises. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater." And so here's part of Paul's argument. Melchizedek was a greater man even than Abraham, which would have been an interesting thought to most of the Jews. But that's the point that Abraham, or Paul rather, is driving for, is that here is Abraham giving a 10th to Melchizedek, acknowledging him as the priest. In this case, mortal men receive tithes, but in that case, one receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives on. And so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. He said this went on even through Levi, who is the descendant of Abraham. Levi, of course, hadn't even been born yet. He was he was going to be yet generations ahead to be born, and it was not yet there to receive tithes, obviously. And yet, so here is Abraham showing his subordination to Melchizedek, and by extension, Levi is subordinate to Melchizedek. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. He had to be the greater man. Yeah. Right. Yeah, he was superior to Abraham. And by extension, he was superior to Levi. And so it shows that, it demonstrates, proves that hierarchy. He goes on, now if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? Here's Paul. He's beginning to now he's going to make his main argument in this area, again based off of this relationship between Abraham and Melchizedek. If everything was going to be arrived at perfectly through the law of Moses, and the order of Levi was already established to help that along, what point was there to have yet another priest according to the order of Melchizedek? Well, the answer is there is none. If God has already established things through essentially through the law of Moses, and the law of Moses is perfect and could make a man perfect, then there is no need for a priest after the order of Melchizedek. But of course, that was not the case. For when the priesthood is changed of necessity, there takes place a change of law also. This is the key point. There has to be a change in the law in order for Jesus to come along as the priest after the order of Melchizedek. Has to be a change in the law. For the one concerning whom these things are spoken, though he belongs to another tribe from which no one has officiated at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, a tribe with reference to which Moses spoke nothing concerning priests. Jesus was not allowed to be a priest under the Old Testament law. Could not be. He was from the tribe of Judah. The priests, of course, were all from the tribe of Levi. Jesus could not be a priest out of the tribe of Judah under the Mosaic law. So Paul argues what has to happen. What does that mean? The implication is had to be a change. There had to be a change in the law. In verse 15, and this is clearer still, if another priest arises according to the likeness of Melchizedek. Any priest that arises after the likeness of Melchizedek can only serve if there's a change in the law, who had become not such on the basis of the law of physical requirement, but according to the power of an indestructible life. For it was witnessed of him, thou art a priest of forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Again, he quotes back to Psalms 110. For on the one hand, there is setting aside of a former commandment because of the weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. And on the other hand, there is the bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. And of course, he goes on from there. But again, I wanted you to see how Paul has used this example of Melchizedek. He has used this example of Abram and his relationship to Melchizedek to prove the high priesthood of Jesus Christ. And he uses these two these two passages that are fairly I won't say obscure, but there's not a lot of emphasis on them for whatever reason. Here's this story about Abram interacting with Melchizedek. Here's noted again in Psalms 110, and you might kind of ponder over that or think on that, but then suddenly you realize, hey, there is something significant here. There is something significant about now here is a foreshadowing of things that are to come, and we see it all as part of God's master plan as he lets it unfold, and we see it unfolding over a period of over 2,000 years that it takes for this from the time this event occurred until its implications were fully realized. And so we end up, when Paul writes about, hey, I'm revealing to you the mystery, that word mystery is secret. Here's the secret, things that God held secret for a long time, and now they've been revealed. Now we can explain them. We know exactly what they mean now. We understand the significance of Abram and Melchizedek. Any other comment or question on that this morning? All right. I'm going to continue on. We're going to continue on into chapter 15 then of Genesis. And here we see, now after these events, as it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be great, very great. And Abram said, O Lord God, what wilt thou give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, since thou hast given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man shall not be your heir, but one who shall come forth from your own body shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, look now and count toward the heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. and he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. God gives him this vision after these events, says, don't worry, I'm going to be a shield to you. I'm going to take care of you, and we're going to fulfill these promises. Abram, he says, don't be afraid. Well, what was Abraham being afraid of? And the answer is perhaps suggested by some scholars who say, Abraham looks around, he's getting old. He's getting older. And suddenly he realizes he's running out of time. His body's getting old and weak. Sarah's body's getting old, and he still doesn't have this son. He's been promised a child, but he says he has no child. And he's, right now his heir is just one of his servants that's been adopted in that sense, adopted as the heir. And so he's seeing this and realizing that I'm running out of time. That kind of happens to a lot of us. We kind of get older in years, and suddenly we look around and we're running out of time. Things that we thought we were going to accomplish, the great things we thought we were going to do, we're running out of time to get them done. God, though, assures Abram and says, no, your heir will be your natural born child. At this point, it would have taken a fair amount of faith for Abram to feel comfortable with that. He says, he even tells him, he says, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. Apparently, this vision, we understand, takes place at night. He's able to look into the night sky and see the stars, and God is telling him, you count the stars and you'll have some idea of the number of your descendants. We see from verse 6 now, it says here that he believed in the Lord, and he was reckoned to him for righteousness, as righteousness. There's been a lot of religious doctrine been built on that one passage. And especially the folks that hold to the faith-only doctrine try to use that verse as a proof text. Number of problems with it. I got them up on the screen a little bit. Rather than trying to go into them, I really don't have enough time to go into them this morning. And I want to save this because I want to get a full discussion of this. So I'm going to save it. I'll be away next Sunday. I think John is going to have a class for you on a week from today. And then I'll be back in 2 weeks, Lord willing, and we'll continue on into chapter 15 and talk about this a little more thoroughly. I appreciate your attention this morning.